Stories are a really broad category and a really important part of our culture. They pop up in very, very different ways, but if you want to understand the culture and where you are, you need to understand stories.
Bold ideas, inspiring stories, dynamic experiences. I'm your host, Dr. John Anderson, president of PennWest. Welcome to the Power of PennWest podcast. Well, welcome to the Power of PennWest podcast, where curiosity meets community and where learning never takes a holiday, not even today on Halloween. We are donning our academic robes and wizard hats to explore the spooky season from a scholarly perspective. To help us do that, we are going to invite Chris LaFuria from behind the podcast booth out into the podcast itself. Chris has been the brains and all the mechanics of this podcast for a long time, and we're going to invite him out to join us to co-host this episode. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Anderson. It's a pleasure to be here on this spooky season, and I am just happy to have two outstanding faculty members and a student to talk about the academic, the entertainment, and the experiential side of Halloween.
Why don't you now introduce a little bit about what we're going to talk about, and then introduce our guest for us.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about what makes monsters so memorable. Why do ghost stories linger in our cultural consciousness? How does Harry Potter cast such a long shadow over both pop culture and pedagogy? Joining us are two brilliant professors from PennWest and a student. Together, they'll share insights from their classroom, their research, and yes, their favorite scary movies and magical reads. From Frankenstein to folklore, from haunted houses to Hogwarts, we're unpacking the academic angles of Halloween and having a little fun along the way. So if you don't mind, we're going to introduce you to our guests, and we will get to know each of their interests and get to know a little bit about them. So first off, we have Dr. William Hunter. He is the chair of English Philosophy and Modern Language Department at PennWest and a scholar in the magic of literature, especially the Harry Potter series. So Dr. Hunter, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you.
So from your background, your research explores transformation, identity, and the narrative power across genres, including African American literature and 19th century conversion narratives. You also advise Edinburgh's theater organization, which helps students bring stories, both magical and the mundane, to stage on life. So if you could begin, talk a little bit about where you got interested in the Harry Potter series and how that kind of impacts your study of literature.
Well, my degree out of Purdue was in American and African American literature. The first books that I ever read were horror and science fiction. I remember the first big boy book that the library let me have was H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. And so that has been a constant part of my reading and film. And then when I came to Edinburgh, we had an opportunity to teach genre fiction, which is where a lot of these narratives kind of are placed now. So I developed courses in science fiction, horror or gothic fiction, and the Harry Potter series as a means to appeal to particularly first-year students, that they could pick a class and read things they were interested in, because if selected carefully, a lot of the same literary issues and forms that you need to talk about in like an intro to literature class, you can find it in most good genre fiction. So as I've taught those to a variety of levels, and I found them fascinating about how much. Now, obviously, there's a clear distinction between really good horror fiction and really bad horror fiction, and that's true of science fiction as well. But we shouldn't condemn an author by the genre in which he or she chooses to write. There are brilliant, people look at Poe in horror fiction, and Jane Austen wrote a Gothic novel. And so we can look at the tendencies of what makes them fit into the genres without losing a lot of the literary and artistic qualities.
And that's interesting. And we definitely want to dive into the genre that you were talking about, and also the literature mechanics in writing a good story and writing something that is both spooky but also is really good storytelling. So let's dig into that after our introduction. So, Dr. Aune, we'll head over to you, our English professor at the California campus, who your research spans Shakespeare, British literature, film, and cultural studies. And I'm sure, along with all the love sonnets and the Romeo and Juliet, there are some spooky, scary things behind Shakespeare. So, how did you get involved in Shakespeare? And would you say that there are some elements of his writing that could be considered in this spooky horror genre that we're talking about?
I had a great Shakespeare teacher in high school, so that I think is really where it started. He was very theatrical in teaching, and I looked for the same thing when I went to college. Shakespeare is full of ghosts, and one of the things that ghosts are supposed to do is frighten the characters, warn them to do something or to not do something. And one of the questions that we can ask when we read the plays is, we don't, in the 21st century, believe in ghosts. They're, of course, something that only people in the past would believe in. Did What did Shakespeare's audience think when Banquo's ghost walked on stage in Macbeth? Did they think it was a real ghost? Did it produce a kind of fear in them that it would never produce in us? Similar with the witches in Macbeth. We have accounts and suspicions that at least some people in Shakespeare's time thought that actual spells were being cast on stage by these witches, which was terrifying. On top of the fact that you were paying money to go see it, you might well have your soul taken and banished into hell. So a lot of it for me comes from that question that I really like asking. What did Shakespeare's audience think about this stuff 300 odd years ago? And what do we think about it today? How different are they, or how similar?
And I think that's a very good question to ask, because you're talking about Shakespeare's audience 300 years ago, but as Dr. Hunter talked about the H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, when that was broadcast on the radio in 1938, people thought it was actually something happening right outside their door. I picked up a record of it from an old vinyl shop, and I listened to it, and I was trying to think back, like, I would not fall for this in the 20th century, but at that time, radio, TV, all these things were new. So you weren't sure whether you were hearing a story or whether you were hearing an actual broadcast. So that's a very good point about the audience receiving this sort of story, this sort of kind of spooky literature, and the
And
performances
more
as well.
recently, the Blair Witch Project.
Yeah, the Blair Witch Project. I don't think I slept for a week, and I don't think I've been camping more than once since I saw the Blair Witch Project. Dr. Anderson, do you remember when the Blair Witch Project came out and your
I do. I
reaction to
remember how
that?
much conversation there was about how little money went into that project, but how far its reach was.
Yeah, there no CGI, no major
Yeah.
budget, just a very well written story that, got a lot of people talking.
And the advertising had a lot of people convinced it was real
Yeah, it was
for,
almost a
for
bummer when you found
months.
out it wasn't real, because it was
Yeah.
so well done. You were scared by it, but you wanted it to be a real story. So that's definitely a fascinating recent example. So our last guest today, we have Kaylee Kennedy, who's a sophomore at Edinburgh, majoring in secondary education, which could be a spooky experience depending in and of itself on where you end up. You also have a concentration in English, so I'm sure a lot of these themes and genres that Dr. Hunter and Dr. Aune are talking about, you've experienced in your coursework. On campus, she's a community assistant for residence life and housing, a student assistant in the honors program, and the treasurer of Edinburgh Student PSEA. She's passionate about campus engagement. And what her claim to fame is for this episode is she's in charge of planning a lot of the Halloween enrichment activities that bring together students in the honors program together for fun and learning. So, Kaylee, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Thank you. We at the honors program are all huge fans of Halloween, at least those of us that work in the office. So especially when October rolls around, we bring back Dr. Solberg, who used to be the director for the honors program. He has always been a very big fan of horror movies and the whole genre. So he holds a 2-night enrichment meeting for our students on Zoom and in person that every year it's a different theme, but the general name is Halloween Horror Nights, so that he can kind of just introduce everyone to the fun of the spooky season and Halloween. And then we also this year have Professor Mamani coming back to teach a enrichment meeting about the Salem witch trials.
Which is another one of those, whether it's a story, whether it's true, everything that happened in that. Obviously, a lot of the events were true, but the stories behind the witches, it's fascinating to discuss what happened back in that time and kind of how it relates to people's reaction in the time. And you mentioned Dr. Solberg, who retired from Edinburgh a few years ago. He recently launched his own YouTube channel called Cinema Scaradiso, kind of a play on Cinema Paradiso, only it's all about Halloween movies, horror comedies, sci-fi comedies. So yes, I can definitely agree with you that the former honors program director, Dr. Solberg, was a huge horror movie buff. So let's get to talking about horror and spookiness as a genre, not just for literature, but for film and theatrics. Why is this something that consumers and viewers like? Why do we like being scared? What is it about these movies, these books that draw our attention so deeply and so passionately that you have something like the ghosts in Shakespeare that have lasted 300 years? You have the Harry Potter series that has been just consumed by the American public and beyond for 30 years. Dr. Hunter, let's start with you. What is it about these themes of horror and being scared that kind of resonate with the American audiences and audiences around the globe?
Well, when I teach the classes, we kind of go back to two arguments. One is that if you look at ancient, even oral traditions, the first stories that were imaginative, that were not realistic stories, tended to be horror stories. In that, as much like Mark was talking about with Banquo's ghost, the ghosts show up as warning. When horrible things happen, they tell you where not to go, who not to trust, what our society believes is good, what our society believes is evil, and we create narratives to support those. So we've always done this to a large degree. But the other part of it is just going to, Aristotle. And the same reason we would watch tragedy is to purge aspects of sorrow, or in our case, fear, without actually having to experience them. So I think there's a lot of just emotional, psychological, ancient cultural connections to why these stories still resonate, because they haven't changed much. I mean, the stories are pretty similar. It's when you can get a new take on it that people become fascinated. We still enjoy the old stories as well, because they still serve the same function, to give us cultural warning and to purge our emotions.
Yeah, the cultural warnings and purging emotions, that sounds very relatable across the generations. But if you think closely, it also kind of reflects societal fears and anxieties. So there's kind of a realistic element. Dr. Aune, how have you found your research in British literature and Shakespeare to kind of relate to what Dr. Hunter was talking about with the warnings, like when you said earlier, the ghosts show up to warn people, but also how did that literature reflect the societal pressures and the anxieties of the day, but kind of captured into a piece of literature?
In the original King Kong film, the filmmaker says that the reason he's going to find King Kong is to reestablish the sense that miracles and fantastic things still exist, even in the modern world. And I think that in part that's what was happening when Shakespeare's audience went to see a play like Macbeth or Hamlet, seeing things that they wouldn't see ordinarily every day, seeing things that they might ask, is it real or is it not real? But it's seeing something miraculous and oftentimes terrifying. And for a playwright, one of the things that happens when groups of people experience extreme emotions together, they tend to bond. You can imagine someone sitting next to you, grabbing you all of a sudden during a film. And there's nothing better for creating an audience that wants to stay and then come back. is creating this sense of bonding with the audience and with the place. Too much scaring, right? Sort of ruins the pot. But I, when I think back, that's what I see a lot of going on in Shakespeare's time. The enjoyment, frankly, of being frightened.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Aune. That's a great point. It's something about getting your blood pressure going, your sense of fear, your ears are tingling, and all that. It's definitely a physical reaction to something that is using words and using pictures to kind of display a story. So, Kylie, over to you. You said you're a Harry Potter fan, and you said that everybody in the honors program, you're big on Halloween. What is it about Halloween, about being scared, about being frightened? Is it that physical reaction, or is it just an escape from the normal aspects of life? What is it that draws you to Halloween, to the spooky season?
I think for me personally, I love the fact that it is kind of like an escape from the norm. I actually last night just went to watch the newest Conjuring movie, which are some of my favorites, and I think a big part of that is that like those are supposed to be based on true stories. So it's not even just an escape from real life, it's seeing things that could be happening every day that we don't know about just because we're not experiencing it.
That's a great point, Kaylee. It's you're not living it currently. It's somebody else's, and you're experiencing that as an onlooker, kind of like what Dr. Hunter said about the tragedies. Like we're watching somebody else go through it. We're kind of analyzing it. So that's a very interesting perspective. Dr. Anderson, are you a big Halloween person? Are you big into scary movies, or can you think of one that kind of stands out to you as something that made you have like a physical reaction to something that's spooky?
I hate to not fit in this group, but I'm just not into the horror scene too much. I will admit, as a kid, I like to go to haunted houses. That's about as close as I get. But I do find it fascinating that people have real passion for this.
Yeah, and it's also interesting because if you look at a haunted house, there's a little bit of storytelling that's involved in that too. It might not necessarily be a big budget Hollywood film or a classic piece of literature, but people are putting their thoughts into the haunted house. They're kind of coming up with a story to kind of trick you into thinking that you're in somewhere haunted. So I think whether I was 5 years old or in my 30s, I still get a little bit of that fear going into a haunted house. And I think it's mostly because of the fear of something unexpected happening.
Yeah, I do find the psychology of fear very interesting. Why people enjoy that, why people enjoy getting scared, why stories continue to last generations. And I'd love to hear from our two good faculty members here about why they think there are certain stories that last generations and some that just kind of fade out.
Yeah, I think like Dr. Hunter, what you said, there's really good horror and science fiction, and there are really bad horror and science fiction. So talk about the good examples that, like Dr. Anderson said, have lasted 200-300 years.
Well, I think what makes a particularly effective horror story is how much it connects to our humanness. When I teach the Harry Potter class, one of the students' project is to take one of the mythical creatures and explain why did we develop as human beings this particular creature. And the one I always use an example is the werewolf, which shows up not always as a wolf, but the same imagery shows up in cultures all around the world throughout history. And it's a way for us to understand the human animal dichotomy of what it means to be us. That there's always going to be a part of us which is a little wilder, a little bit more vicious, that we feel that we need to control with our humanness. And the werewolf is the example of when that switches, when the beast becomes dominant over the human. And so that's a way for us to talk about that. For centuries, vampire stories have, to a large degree, been sexual, and they some modern retellings have altered that quite a bit. I would recommend Sinners, the film that was just out last summer, as a way of dealing with that. But it if they tap into something that we're already thinking, are already feeling and helping us understand it in a way that we find both comforting and discomforting, that's what lasts forever. I mean, we're still doing Dracula. As a matter of fact, one of the you mentioned the theater season in Edinburgh. One of them is a Dracula parody, which in the spring semester.
And that's an interesting point to, if you want to talk a little bit about the theater, how you can not only do the stories themselves last 300 years, but people are always having their take on that. They're
Yeah,
adjusting the stories, or they're kind of taking it from its original text and converting it into something more relevant. So yeah,
yeah,
talk about that experience.
and sometimes they don't work. I
Yeah,
mean,
true.
many people disagree with me, but I do not like Anne Rice's take on vampirism, the Interview with the Vampire series. She just broke down all the metaphoric value of them and tried to recreate it as something else, and it just doesn't work for me. While as the film Sinners that I was talking about has a completely different take on it, and I think it works very well. So it's where you can take that image of desire and what you do with it, whether it's sexual or cultural or whatever, and have the need for that played through a vampire, it's going to work. And so, there are always going to be parodies. As odd as it sounds, I love the old Universal movie monster movies, including Abbott and Costello meet Dracula,
That's bold.
which is not scary, by the way, but it's very good.
But and you also have one of my favorite adaptations is Mel Brooks's Young Frankenstein, because it takes something like the original Frankenstein monster story and kind of turns into something humorous. But Frankenstein is another one of those stories, I think, that kind of gets misinterpreted the more we listen to it, the more we have adaptations, because it does talk about, prejudice and having this ugly monster that Dr. Frankenstein created, but it also touches about themes of isolation and family responsibility and ambition that kind of go under the radar because of the monster side of it. So,
Yeah.
Dr. Aune, I saw you nodding your head when Dr. Hunter was talking about the horror movies. So, if you could kind of take this on, the question of horror and these themes in the literature, but also some of the monster movies that you've included in some of your classes and some of the things that you kind of consume just as a movie viewer.
One of the things that I enjoy about teaching the monster classes is there's this great collection of, as Bill mentioned, the Universal monsters, King Kong, Dracula, Frankenstein from the 1930s, and they've been regularly remade, almost by clockwork. I enjoy sitting down with the students and watching Dracula from 1931, and then watching, well, we haven't had a chance to see Sinners yet, but the 1992, for example, Dracula, which is in color. And what makes a vampire frightening in 1992 is quite different than what makes a vampire frightening in 1931. And it's really not so much about the vampire, it's about what scares us. We would laugh at Bela Lugosi in his tuxedo and cape, but Gary Oldman wearing cutting edge fashion and speaking poetry is another matter altogether.
That's very interesting. So taking something that was originally written kind of carries on the legacy of that literature. As two English professors, what are your thoughts on people taking these original stories? And even you could talk about Shakespeare, Dr. Ani, and how there's been remakes of Romeo and Juliet and how it's been Hollywoodified and made something completely different. I guess, Kayla, let's go over to you about that. Your concentration's in English, so you've encountered a lot of this literature. As somebody who's read literature but also has been exposed to a lot of the newer translations of these things, a lot of the newer fiction, how do you feel about the connection between classic literature and the modern idea of monsters and being scared?
I think obviously the big point of like making modern iterations is to continue to engage newer audiences as society changes and pop culture evolves. And I think a big part of it is just like trying to keep the original messages without like convoluting it too much with new themes. But I think it is a great way, like making new iterations of everything is a great way to continue to tell these stories and to have audiences engaged in lessons that were being taught in the 1800s, 1900s, and on and on.
I like the idea, Kaylee brought up lessons, and one of the ways I think about the durability of these stories is that they do have lessons. The durable ones have lessons that we haven't yet learned. So the stories that we forget are of no use for us, but we still need to know how to distinguish between friend and foe, family and stranger, what's going to eat us and what we can eat. And those are some of the basic lessons that stories and films teach us. Whether it's a giant gorilla, no one really can imagine somebody wanting to drink your blood, but you mention it to virtually anyone out the door, they'll know exactly what you're talking about. We haven't figured out what to do with vampires yet, so they're going to be with us until we do.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
A recent example of that is I think not only are these stories constant, I think they kind of come up in bunches. I mean, there was a whole about a 10-year period where everything was zombies, and another 10-year period where everything was vampires. And in the zombie period, Colson Whitehead, who is one of the few writers to win back-to-back Pulitzer Prizes for fiction, in a previous book wrote a zombie novel called Zone One, in which the idea where he takes the zombie metaphors about just number, and Mark was talking about what we're afraid of, and he was talking about that what we're really afraid of is race. That you have this main narrator who's you don't find out he's black until the very end of the novel, and you have to go back and think, well, were people afraid of him because they thought he was a zombie, or because he's a lone black guy coming up on their farm?
That's interesting.
And so it's a fascinating book, and so it is. And I think the idea of being afraid is constant, but what we're afraid of, we need to constantly reevaluate.
That's really interesting, and it actually segues to my next question that I have for everybody. So we talked a lot about learning these pieces of literature, these plays, these movies to understand theme and understand our own fears and anxieties. But as academic professors, there's also things that you can teach relative to your program. So English literature. So there are hundreds of thousands of genres, authors, themes. Why do you think, and Dr. Aune, we'll start with you, why do you think it's important to include ghost stories, monster stories in a literature course or in an English course, whether it's writing or reading that literature? Why that topic? Why has that stood the test of time and something that you want to include in your academic program?
The first thing I would say is what Kaylee and Bill have been saying as well, that the stories are endlessly durable, whether it's a 19th century version or a 21st century version. Along with that, they're generally familiar. So it's a way to present students with a familiar narrative, character, conflict that would allow them to move on to something more challenging, something more literary, for lack of a better word. Colson Whitehead novel is a perfect example of that. Watching some Walking Dead and then reading it, sort of like a gateway, but what's meaningful about them both is similar, and the students generally recognize that. So for me, I guess ultimately it's a way to introduce to students and talk about the notion that stories are a really broad category and a really important part of our culture. They pop up in very, very different ways, but if you want to understand the culture and where you are, you need to understand stories.
Let me follow up on that for just a minute. I love that idea of understanding stories to understand who we are and kind of our place in the world. You said something, Dr. Ani, a little while ago that I want to follow up on, and that is that some of these characters or some of these myths stay with us, and I think you said because we haven't solved them yet or we don't understand them. I think that's an interesting way to look at this genre of literature, is that there are so many things we don't understand about afterlife, the afterworld, scary moments, when we're scared, why we're scared. And maybe this is our way of grappling with trying to understand that in some way. Any thoughts on that?
I think that's a great way to think about it is one way to understand something, right, is to make up a story about it. You can control the characters, the conflict, the setting. How many dozens or scores of flood narratives exist across the culture and time? It's a story that people use to answer some questions and make themselves feel better. And it's very easy for one generation to look back at the previous generation and sort of laugh at how perhaps silly or ignorant they might be. But I guess don't laugh at the ark when you're not wearing boots.
Over to Dr. Hunter. I know we were talking about the themes and all that good stuff, but let's talk about literary genres and how you use horror stories and ghost stories and popular fiction to get into that idea of genre literature in your classes.
Well, that's actually hard, in that, so like take Frankenstein. Well, is Frankenstein horror fiction or is it science fiction? In a lot of ways, it's also fantasy. And so we tend to have very thin walls in between what is and is not a genre. So we try to define what makes it this over that. The main distinction between science fiction and horror is, why does the bad thing show up, and is science going to help you or hurt you? And so what genre fiction essentially does is give you a set of expectations. And again, going back to the Zone One novel, if you pick it up and you know who Colson Whitehead is, you go, "Oh, this is going to be about race." If you don't, this is going to be about zombies, and your expectations are completely different. And so when you read the little word on the spine or the back of the book, and you know what your expectations are, then it's up to the author to meet them, and the good ones also do not meet them. Play with them, stretch them. Detective fiction is another genre I've taught quite a bit, where Agatha Christie wrote how many stories and how could she make them all interesting? She didn't do it by always having a simple solution. So it's that's what I think makes it literary versus just genre fiction, is where are they meeting and where are they stretching your expectations of what you expect as a reader.
That's fascinating. It's interesting to take a look at what makes the stories interesting, but also what makes the writing and what makes the conversations around that interesting as well. And I think Kayla, you'll be involved in a lot of that as you become a secondary English teacher. So let's talk, for example, you got into Harry Potter, you love Halloween, and I imagine you like to read and write, being having a concentration in English. So how do you take your love of Harry Potter and this genre, for lack of a better word, how do you expect to use it in your own teaching? How do you want to make these stories and these themes come alive and when you teach to the next generation of readers?
I think the biggest part of it is that like obviously these stories and these books have a huge readership because of how interesting they are and because of their themes. So I feel like it'll be somewhat easy to make sure my students are engaged in these stories, but also just making sure, like, obviously it'll have to fit into the curriculum, but making sure that they're still, while enjoying it, understanding like the underlying meanings and messages of the texts, so that while obviously they can enjoy all the spooky parts of any horror novel or the wonderful magic of Harry Potter, they're also still learning the themes of, like, for example, in Harry Potter, like friendship and teamwork and things like that.
That's very interesting. And it's also something that, the classic literature is awesome, but it's great to have some current examples that are relatable to students to kind of have a mix of, you get your Shakespeare, you get some current novels and interpretations of these things too. So that's very interesting. And I think you're going to have a fun time kind of presenting all these different ideas to high school students and, the next generation. So as we prepare to wrap up, which I think we could have a 3-hour episode on this because there's so much when it comes to horror movies and scary literature and events like that. The final thought I want to get from all of you is kind of like an elevator pitch for this type of literature or movie. So tell us why we should pick up a scary book or why we should go to a scary movie. What is it about that experience that you would suggest to somebody that's like, well, I'm not a big scary movie person, or, oh, I think Harry Potter's for kids. Give me your elevator pitch as to why we should engage in that sort of content, that sort of entertainment. Let's start with you, Dr. Hunter.
Well, I want to draw a distinction between a movie and a book, not so much from quality or just the experience. You go to see a horror movie in a theater with a big crowd, and you have a shared experience. I think Mark was talking about
That's
that. I
interesting.
remember when I saw Blair Witch Project, and usually the movie's over and everybody's chatting, it was dead silence. 250 people in the theater, not a word leaving. You pick up a horror novel to experience it on your own, and this is when I think it's actually scarier, is when you're all by yourself. And I read a lot, and the only books I read all night are horror stories, because I just want to make sure everybody I like survives, and they don't always do that. They just drag you in and you cannot get out.
I remember I first read Frankenstein for a class at Edinburgh, and I was in a drafty old apartment, and the heater had quit right when I started the story. So I was sitting there in a sleeping bag with a candle. It's something like a Hollywood writer would have written, and it's a big book. And I think I cracked out like 250 pages just in one sitting because I was in the moment and I was experiencing this by myself. It was almost like a surreal moment where I was part of the story, but also consuming the story. And it's an experience I'll never forget. So over to you, Dr. Aune. Give us your elevator pitch about horror and ghost stories and things like that.
I'm going to spin off a little about what Bill said and community. And reading a novel is an individual experience. But what I would say to someone is, when you read a horror or a vampire or a monster novel and you finish it, whether you know it or not, you've become part of a community, the people who have read that book, the people who know something a little bit more about zombies or about race. And that can be a kind of a calling card or a conversation starter. Initially, it is an isolating experience, but it very easily turns into the opposite. And you never know, the person sitting right next to you might be a horror fan. You just haven't started the conversation.
That's funny. I was at a football game this past weekend, and my son was across the field, and I yelled Wingardium Leviosa to him. And I heard some people in the background yell, "Hey, that's Harry Potter." So you're right. When you do consume this literature, these movies, you become part of that community that has engaged with it. So, Kaylee, over to you. What is it about this genre? Why would you recommend? But also the program that you've created with the honors program. Why would you recommend somebody that's kind of on the fence to take advantage of those programs and the stories and the books?
Speaking on the honors program events that I've organized, I highly recommend to anyone who asks me oh, which enrichment meeting should I go to, or which ones are more interesting. I always recommend the Halloween ones, just because, going off of kind of what Dr. Aune said, they do kind of bring such a large community of people with so many different interests and different majors and things that they're doing together, not just through the honors program, but through these shared interests of spooky themes and horror, in order to talk about it and give their different points of views and their understandings of these movies or these these true events that happened with the Salem witch trials. Going into just literature and movies, it gives you kind of a way to think on your, especially with novels, to think about it on your own and interpret for yourself. Well, what does this mean? Or what is this novel trying to teach me? Or what are these spooky characters? What is the meaning behind them?
Yeah, that's fascinating because people can read Shakespeare and come away with two different interpretations. And I think that's kind of the goal with these stories and this literature, is that, there are themes and morals and all that stuff. But if I take a different meaning, that's not necessarily a wrong thing. It's just my personal engagement with that literature. Dr. Anderson, you came into this episode saying that you're not really a horror or scary movie type person. Has this conversation changed your mind at all? Or have you been coming up with a list of movies and books to read as we've been chatting?
Chris, I do have a confession to make. There is one movie that probably turned me off of the genre when I was a kid, and it scared me to death. 1966. This is before I was born, but it's Don Knotts, The Ghost, and Mr. Chicken. Something about that organ playing itself. I don't know.
Are we familiar with that movie, Dr. Hunter, Dr. Aune?
Yes, yeah.
I'll
But
have
that
to
is a
check that one
classic.
out. I can't imagine Don Knotts being too scary in a movie, but if that's a recommendation, I'll have to take a look at
Yeah. I had a bunch of ones that I thought he was going to suggest, and that was not it.
it.
I'd love to hear from each of you. How do you take this love of this genre and this love of understanding fear in our lives and celebrate it on this day of Halloween? Any special traditions you've got or anything you're going to do tonight?
Turner
We
Classic Movies.
You said Turner Classic
They
Movies?
always have the best, starting at usually midnight on the 30th to midnight on the 31st. They have all horror movies, almost all black and white,
Uh-huh.
all day.
Dr. Ani?
I don't have a front door or a porch, which is just about the worst position to be in on Halloween. So I put together some sort of costume and take bags of candy out and distribute them to creatures I find on the streets and their parents.
Well, that's great. Kaylee, how are you and your friends going to celebrate?
Well, through the whole month of October, I always try and watch as many scary movies as possible. I watched the entire Harry Potter series. Not that I wouldn't do that outside of October, but and then specifically on Halloween, it's actually my dad's birthday, so we always watch whatever movie he chooses and eat whatever spooky food he's decided he wants to create for dinner.
That's great. We'll have at our house some pumpkin stew, probably.
Mm.
Shell out a pumpkin and cook a stew inside. It's really a fun event for us as well. Well, Chris,
And
it's nice to have you out from behind the desk, and thanks for joining this episode.
you got it. I had a blast, Dr. Hunter, Dr. Ani, and Kaylee. It's been great chatting with all of you.
Thank
Before
you.
we go, one thing I want Dr. Anderson to know, I don't know what campus he's on currently, but when he's at Edinburgh campus, Reader Hall, top floor, is the most classically haunted place on campus.
I'm glad you said
I
that because I am currently sitting in room 309 on Reader Hall, which happens to be on the third floor. So
Yep,
thank you for not letting me be able to sleep tonight. I
there you
actually
go.
have heard from people that they can hear piano playing late at night
Yeah.
and early in the morning. So that's just great.
Now you got me
So
thinking. I'm
Dr.
going to have to
Anderson's never
explore.
coming back to Edinburgh's campus.
Well, this has been such an interesting conversation, and I'm going to make sure that I check under the covers and behind the doors when I get home tonight. Thanks for giving us insight into the genre of horror films, books, movies, and all the rest. And I hope all of you have a wonderful Halloween. Thanks, Kaylee, Dr. Hunter, Dr. Ani.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.